So welcome back to Abolitionist Visions and Intersections, a summit hosted by the American Library Association's Social Responsibilities Roundtable, or SRRT. SRRT believes that libraries and librarians must center social responsibility by recognizing and helping solve social problems and inequities to work towards the common good. My name is April Shepard, and I am the co-coordinator of SRRT. I am also a member of the Rainbow Roundtable, and I'm wearing my Rainbow Roundtable shirt for this presentation. I am joined behind the scenes by Rachel Rosekind and Rebecca Black. Before we begin, I have a couple of quick housekeeping items. You may have already heard these, but in case you haven't. First, to enable captions, click on the More button in the bottom right of your Zoom screen and then show captions. Our sessions are being recorded and they should be available on the SRRT website sometime in April. Please keep your cameras off and mics off unless you are a presenter. Please be respectful and extend care and compassion to yourself and others. This includes using person-first language when posing questions or sharing information in the chat. Please refrain from using dehumanizing language such as prisoner, convict, or ex-con, and instead use language which emphasizes the personhood of these populations, such as incarcerated person, justice-involved individual, or justice-impacted person, for example. Please use the Q&A to post questions and reserve the chat for any tech issues, resource sharing, or appreciation for our panelists. If the Q&A button is not on your Zoom, it is going to be under More in the right-hand part of your screen. We should have time for Q&A after the presentation is concluded. So on to our presentation. Our session is called Prison Book Bans, How the Texas Prison System Denies Incarcerated Women and the LGBTQIA+ communities their own experiences. Lioness Justice Impacted Women's Alliance, in partnerships with students from the University of Texas and Texas A&M University, are going to talk to us about the Texas After Violence Project, community-based archive prison book bans, and how censorship is an effort to control and negate the experiences of women and the LGBTQI+ community. Our presenters are Harris Dubin, a third-year law student at Texas A&M Law School who has worked both the Innocent Project Clinic and the Civil Rights Clinic during law school. Raquel Garcia, the Community Archives Manager of the Texas After Violence Project. Jake Langford, the third-year law student at Texas A&M University, who focuses on immigration law and family law. He is also part of Texas A&M's Civil Rights Legal Clinic. Marci Marie Simmons, the Community Outreach Coordinator for Lioness Justice Impacted Women's Alliance, co-host of On the Rec Yard, Women's Prison Podcast. She uses her voice as a formerly incarcerated woman to educate others about their unique experiences of surviving 10 years in a state prison. Jennifer Toon, the project director of Lioness Justice Impacted Women's Alliance, where she uses her 27 years of system involvement, both as a juvenile and as an adult, to help end the incarceration and systematic devaluing of girls and women in the Texas criminal legal system. And then finally, Hannah Whelan, the documentation archives director of the Texas After Violence Project, whose personal experience as the daughter of someone who was incarcerated informs her belief in the effective testimonial power of personal materials. So thank you all. I look forward to this presentation. You may begin.
Thank you so much for having us. And my internet, of course, when we start, is saying it's unstable. So if I disappear, I trust Marci to carry on without me for our part. But yes, so thank you for having us. Let's jump right into it. So Marci, let's you and I share with everybody our personal experiences about book bans for incarcerated women in our communities inside. I'll start with what we always start with as our credibility in our community, which is I did over 20 years in the system. And so not only was I an incarcerated woman, I was the incarcerated library clerk. So I essentially was the librarian at the units that I was housed at. And so not only did I experience these types of book bans, from the mailroom when I would get a book that somebody would send in, I often asked for lesbian romance novels or books about self-help to deal with trauma, sexual trauma. And they were denied, often denied for really ludicrous reasons under these different buckets of denials that Jake and Harris will talk a little bit more about. But I also saw that in the library, right? Like, because there's two layers of censorship happening through the department, through the mailroom, and then again with the Wyndham School District, which is the school district with inside the prison system in Texas that is over our libraries. So they also get to decide what books are on the library shelves, which is the main source, the main place where incarcerated folks go to get their reading material. So we often, working in the library, I did have a co-conspirator as a boss. She would get, she would get stuff sent from Huntsville, which is where the admin of the Texas prison system is. And she, from library services, sometimes she would get a list of stuff that was just very arbitrary of, I remember they told her one time, I want all the smut off the shelves. It was back when 50 Shades of Grey came out. Not my favorite reading material in terms of literature, but guess what? Those women were coming to the library to read. And that was the most important thing. And so, my boss, who was a Free World staff member, she drug her feet trying to pull stuff off the shelf. But again, it was this idea that whatever was being banned or censored came from this place of denying certain experiences, right? Whether that was LBGTQ plus fiction, whether that was self-help books that talked about, sexual trauma, anatomy books to help women understand their health. Marci, share with folks your experience.
Well, yeah, I want to talk about I spent 10 years incarcerated in Texas, and I spent my entire 30s incarcerated. And so as a 32, 33, 35, 37-year-old woman, my body's changing. Things are happening that hadn't happened before. And I had a lump in my breast at one point. And I thought, man, I've never even given myself a self examination, and I didn't know really how to go about doing that. So I had my mom send in some books related to that. And if she sent in 3 books, they told me they were coming. She told me they were coming. I was kind of excited because I knew that those books would not only help me, but I knew that the ladies around me weren't taking that self-care for themselves. And I thought that this would be a positive impact on not only myself, but the ladies I was incarcerated with. I get a pass one evening to go to the mailroom. I'm hoping I'm going to pick up my books, and I go, and of course I get that denial. And it was for nudity, because those books definitely showed a female anatomy. And so that was out. After that, I was incarcerated on a different unit than Jennifer Toon, so I didn't visit her going to the library, but I go to the library on my unit in search of something, right? And so I do find a health book that has no images. So you can imagine trying to give someone any kind of instruction about anatomy without no imagery whatsoever. And that's kind of what we had to go by. I don't know how somebody brought in, and I feel like it must have been a staff member, a card that had how to do a self breast examination. And we passed around that card, and some of the ladies drew like that was, and it was contraband, it was illegal. We could have gotten disciplinary action for that. But that's the kind of ways that we were suppressed in learning, not only just reading and just that educating ourselves, but educating ourselves about our very own bodies.
Sure. I remember the women would come in looking for those self-help books and those medical books, and having not being able to give them the material that they needed, and really thinking about those stories, like the fiction, right? Like looking for LBGTQ plus fiction on the shelves was impossible, right? And so what does this do to an incarcerated person, right? It felt like, if I can't see myself reflected in the things in the material that I'm reading, it's almost like I'm being gaslit into I don't exist, right? Or my experiences don't exist. Because, I mean, the shelves were full of James Patterson and horrible murder mysteries where women are decapitated and sexually assaulted and everything else. And you have these very heterosexual, intense erotica right on the shelf, right? And I'm not saying don't provide those things, but when that's all you see, then you're like, well, I don't matter. I don't exist. And to me, it always felt like it was a very covert, subtle way to like eliminate us. Like to eliminate our stories is to eliminate identity. And it was really infuriating. And I can't wait to hear from Hannah and Raquel for them to tell us what the Texas After Violence Project is and their ideas of why the state does that. But I'll turn it over to Jake and Harris for them to talk about some of the research they've been doing with us to really start to put a spotlight on this.
Okay. Sorry, we're sharing computer technical difficulties on our end. Good morning, everyone. I'm Harris Dubin, and this is Jake Langford. As our introduction said, we're 3L students here in the Civil Rights Clinic here at Texas A&M. So we've been helping Lioness out with some research focused specifically on Texas and book bans here and specifically our women's prisons. So something that we've come across is that mail and other correspondence, as Jennifer talked about, is highly regulated when it comes into the prison to try and reach incarcerated persons. TDCJ, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, is tasked with regulating all the correspondence, and as recently as December, this past December, they put out new policy that kind of to govern how they go about this. As a large summary, it states all incoming and outgoing correspondence, except as otherwise provided in this policy, is subject to delivery, inspection, and rejection in accordance with the following rules. And so in implementing these rules, there's a group called the Mail System Coordinators Panel, MSCP, and they provide training for mailroom staff, or are supposed to provide training for mailroom staff, and how to screen mail. And so we'll go through on the next couple of slides and talk about some of the policies and how they're implemented.
So let me share our screen. Okay, can y'all see that, Jennifer and Marci? Perfect.
We can see it, but it's not full screen. I don't know if you wanted it full screen or not.
Okay.
Oh, right down there. The one that looks like a whiteboard. There we go.
Better. Okay, so these are from policy put out by the TDCJ, like Harris said, in December. There we go. And this is what Jennifer was speaking about when she said books are banned in these specific categories. So we kind of wanted to go through the categories and then highlight some examples of books we've seen that are banned. So there we go. So these are the first two categories. It says it contains content that could facilitate an escape. It contains information regarding the manufacture of explosive weapons or drugs. And so these two categories are fairly self-explanatory. Books are banned if they would facilitate an escape or help someone manufacture weapons or drugs. In practice, we've seen examples where these categories have used to ban books that have maps of Texas because they say that could facilitate an escape if an incarcerated person has a map of the entire state of Texas. So this one next, it says it contains material that a reasonable person would construe as written solely for the purpose of communicating information designed to achieve the breakdown of prisons through inmate disruption, such as strikes, disturbances, riots, or security threat group activity. So we've seen this category used to ban books that are pretty like abolitionist texts and describing like a world without police. So this category will be used to ban that. All right, the next category is a specific determination has been made that the publication contains graphic presentations of sexual behavior that is in violation of law, such as rape, incest, sex with a minor, bestiality, or necrophilia. So we've seen this category, and I think Jennifer kind of mentioned this, used to ban memoirs from survivors of rape and sexual assault. And so it kind of shows that the mailroom staff has very wide discretion, and they seem to be able to ban anything that mentions the topic of rape, even if it's helping people survive the trauma of rape or just like stories from survivors. And so it's just a lot of discretion for the mailroom staff.
This next category is it contains material on setting up and the operation of criminal schemes, or how to avoid detection of criminal schemes by lawful authorities charged with responsibility for detecting such illegal activity. This one is kind of like A and B, more concerned with preventing crime and sort of self-explanatory. F, and Marci spoke about this one. This one is another example of the large discretion given to mailroom officials. It contains sexually explicit images, however, subject to review by the MSCP on a case-by-case basis. Publications constituting educational, medical, scientific, or artistic materials, including anatomy, medical reference books, general practitioner reference books or guides, National Geographic, or artistic reference material depicting historical, modern, or postmodern era art may be permitted. So we've seen this one used to ban especially LGBTQ material and women's health information, as Marci was talking about. And the exception does not generally allow for self-help books, as Marci mentioned. So there's, again, a large room for discretion by mailroom officials and how this is implemented. There is, just like Marci was saying, just a bunch of discretion in how these are implemented, and there's not really clear guidance that we've been able to identify that points to a direction of this is clearly educational, this is clearly medical or scientific, and should be allowed under the exception. It seems that, as Marci mentioned, it's anatomy, so we're gonna cut it out. And that's kind of where our research is pointed.
Mm-hmm. So for example, for that category, there was a book that was banned in Texas in October of 2019 by Dr. Jen Gunter, and it's called The Vagina Bible. And like Marci said, it just has drawings of the female reproductive system, and they were deemed sexually explicit, even though the book aims to give women accurate and unbiased information about the female reproductive system. So a lot of, well, let me turn my share off. There we go. So a lot of the research that we've done has focused on a report put out by PEN America. And so PEN America published a report that has lists of banned books across America. And we discovered that Texas is the state in the United States with the second most books that are denied approval. So in Texas, there's around 10,000 books that are banned. The state that's above us is Florida, and they have about 23,000 books that are banned. And so that report was really helpful because it lists the state where the book was banned, the reason for the denial based on the categories we just went over, and then they put the exact page numbers that are referenced in the book that triggered the specific denial. So when this denial happens in Texas, there is an automatic appeal process. So the book that was denied can be automatically appealed to a board that will review the denial. But the problem with this is the individual doesn't get to see the book. So even though they're like specific pages that were cited for having sexually explicit content or whatever the category is, the individual who's appealing doesn't get to see why the book was denied. So basically they're appealing blindly. And so from the research we've done, like in Texas, it's an automatic appeal, but in other states, a lot of incarcerated individuals just don't even appeal because they don't believe it's going to work, or they have no knowledge of like what the reason the book was denied for.
Yeah. So Jennifer already touched on the Wyndham school district and its implementation of bans here in Texas. I think what our research has shown is that the most kind of egregious use of the Wyndham system is that if something makes it through TDCJ, it still has to go through Wyndham. So there's this double level of censorship that's occurring here in Texas that makes it extremely difficult. And there's not a whole lot of light being shed on Wyndham's activities. Just that for our research has not revealed a whole lot about how they operate and how they come up with their decisions. So we've also focused a lot on the case law that's come out of challenges to these book bans here in Texas. And what prison officials have pretty much argued and courts have largely gone along with is that while incarcerated persons have First Amendment rights, they are severely curtailed, and courts don't seem to have much of an issue with that. And basically, as long as prison officials can articulate some sort of safety, vague notions of safety, the court will go along with their argument to the detriment of incarcerated persons trying to receive books. For example, as we've talked about, people getting reading material that deals with rape, prison officials have argued that even if these are self-help books or just, what we would consider, literary classics, the idea is that if people have access to this material, it will encourage that kind of behavior. But there's really no evidence of that. It's just the argument that is put out into the court system. We've also seen, as Jennifer talked about, wide discretion being used to ban books about the LGBTQ community. And as Jennifer talked about, this has had a effect of sort of pushing those people into the sidelines, almost as if they don't exist. And the thought that if we take away this material from prisons, that it won't happen, and that these people won't exist. And there's really no articulable reason that has been placed into court as to why this should exist.
So I think we'll wrap it up real quick. Jennifer and Marci highlighted this point excellently. So we're the law students. So we do the research in the case law and the policy behind why these book bans are happening. But the research is really important because individuals are impacted. And so these bans are affecting incarcerated individuals mentally, emotionally, and sometimes even physically, as Marci said, because you don't have access to books that are self-help and helping you get through trauma and helping you get through sickness. And so women specifically are denied many publications having to do with female anatomy because they contain images of the female reproductive system, and that's deemed sexually explicit. It seems like all books containing reference to rape are typically banned, even if the topic is generally about healing from the trauma of rape, which people would benefit from. And so it's just, we think the research is really important because women deserve to read this information about their bodies or learn how to cope with traumatic experiences. And like Jennifer highlighted, it's also extremely important for people who identify as LGBTQ to read these stories and feel like they matter and have information about others who identify as LGBTQ and that they can relate to. And so to have those stories to be able to relate to. But we have enjoyed doing this research and we've enjoyed working with Jennifer and Marci. They're both wonderful people. But that is about all we have. So we will turn it over to Hannah and Raquel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you to Jen and Marci for inviting us to be here. I have an immense amount of admiration for the people in this room, which makes me nervous, but it also is really heartening. Raquel and I are both here from the Texas After Violence Project, which is a public memory archive that documents the impacts of state-sanctioned violence, including incarceration and the death penalty in Texas, but increasingly beyond Texas as well. Aside from book bans and censorship being an issue of access to education and information, I think Marci and Jen are really reminding us that it's also identity building and the establishment of connections to individual and familial and community legacies that occur through situating your story alongside the stories of others. And I think it's important that we view books and stories for this reason as a form of almost emotional currency or exchange. I think we know also that the abstraction of an incarcerated person's ability to document or situate their own experience is a constant and very intentional mechanism that safeguards institutional and carceral power. But in doing so, it's further encouraging people who are incarcerated to go to greater lengths to create and protect their memories and stories. And we do a lot of work with people who are currently incarcerated, a lot of people who are currently on death row and who are trying to do just that. One unique thing I think we're all up against right now is with tablets and mail digitization. We're seeing both surveillance and censorship take on less visible forms, and therefore denial becomes an even less visible form of punishment. And I think that abolition teaches us that making denial and erasure more visible to the public brings us towards worlds in which care and accountability take precedence. So I believe it's really imperative that we're all concerned with understanding what is being withheld, under what pretenses, and how we're going to make it visible, reverse it, and ultimately create legacies of identity building and story sharing that can help us help people on the inside survive and maintain connections to communities on the outside. I do really agree with the framework of book bans as an education access issue, but I think it's also an issue of how are we going to make sure people have a reason to live and to even want to learn? And at TAVP, we started a project in the past year called the Legacy After Loss Collection, which contains interviews, personal papers, artwork, correspondence, and tributes that ultimately pay homage to people who have been killed by the death penalty or who have died while on death row in Texas. We receive outreach constantly from loved ones after an execution, seeking a place for correspondence to go, looking for a place to go to talk. And this was really our response to that. The relationships that kind of emerge in this project are bonds between incarcerated writers and their pen pals, friendships that are born out of spiritual communities and spiritual counsel, any number of other relationships between people who are on death row and their loved ones on the outside. And what we find time and time again through this storytelling project or through any other storytelling project we're engaged with is that talking about books, music, media of any form is not only a lifeline for people who are facing execution, but it's a critical form of connection for loved ones who are on the outside, who are desperately trying to connect and forge a lasting shared legacy with someone who they love, who the state of Texas is going to execute. And books and songs and poetry and plays, visual art, albums truly come up so frequently in these conversations that I almost want each oral history or component of the project to have a syllabus of sorts that kind of like helps us remember who each person was and the rich storytelling and artistic worlds that they were engaged with. And importantly, how these worlds still live within the people left behind. So thank you, Jen and Marci, for inviting both Raquel and I. And before I get too far off track, Raquel, do you want to hop in?
Sure. I'll try to be brief. So although the effort has existed for a long time, we are currently seeing a surge of communities exercising their right to representation in the libraries and archives space. It's an ask that has been amplified through organizing and our current channels of communication. Thank you, social media. The point being is that it can't be ignored anymore. It shouldn't be ignored anymore. We as library and information science professionals should recognize the importance of representation and its role in strengthening a community's sense of belonging and building empowerment. These are the foundational blocks of memory work. We've read about it. We see it everywhere now with social media. This concept applies to everyone, including people who are currently incarcerated, perhaps even more so. The criminal legal system wishes to portray prisons and jails as centers of punishment and rehabilitation. But how can that be true if these censorship practices actively severs the relationship between people who are currently incarcerated with their communities outside of prisons and jails? These censorship practices erase communities, identities, and discourages self-love and acceptance, all of which are important aspects of healing. To read a book is an experience, a very subjective one. It can only be dictated and interpreted by the reader. The information garnered from this experience is vast. It's great. We can learn, we can feel, we can grow. To filter out these experiences using a vague codification system to be freely interpreted by personnel who may or may not be trained is devastating. And it contradicts the very nature of rehabilitation that that individuals currently incarcerated in the prison system are supposed to receive. In fact, it perpetuates and compounds the harm that they've experienced. And it fosters a feeling of isolation that can linger for a very long time, ultimately impacting incarcerated folks' ability to interact with or reintegrate to life outside prison. So this is only one facet of harm and oppression that the prison system imposes on vulnerable communities. And this is what abolition work seeks to dismantle and transform. So yeah, that's it. Thank you, Jen and Marci, for inviting us into this space.
Thank you everyone for your unique perspectives and for the research, right? Because me and Marci know, and that we talk a lot about at Lioness, is that our experiences as women and trans men and women, this is such a unique, nuanced way that they do this to our populations. And it's really hard to articulate the very covert ways that they are constantly attacking incarcerated women in these communities. And so I remember on the inside, and I'm sure Marci would agree, is that when we would get these denials, and this is like any of the denials that come through the mailroom, also get this very petty interpretation, whether it's books or whether it's letters. We are policed in a way that incarcerated men are not. We just are. And it's really been hard to articulate that in a way that people can really hold and understand. Would you agree, Marci?
No, I absolutely agree. And that's why it's so important for researchers like the gentleman here today to collaborate with community-based organizations that have lived experience, and especially for us in the prison system, right? Because when they're hearing the information, they have means and ways to go about and prove it. Right? What we know, they're able to show proof of what we already know from our experiences, but it's almost sometimes when we say what's going on in there, we get feedback that are like, oh, that doesn't sound right. That can't be right. And so what's incredible is when we come with these researchers and with this research, and when this final product is there and we can say, no, this is what's going on and this is why it needs to be changed. So when we're talking to legislators and policymakers, and we have big organizations, big universities backing that research, that's huge for us.
Yeah, and also, you know, what Hannah and Raquel touched on is the power of books to create community, and that they're tangible things in our community. And I won't get overly emotional. I'll try not to. But the reason why this is so important to me is that I love books. I was a librarian. I'm a writer. I'm a freelance writer. I worked in the library, Marci, for 10 solid years. And I fought really hard to make that a space. And I know that wasn't the case on your unit, right? But even the access to the library, the officers just, it was just this obsession with, are you going to meet your girlfriend in the library? Like, are you going to do, like, there was no real encouragement to spend the whole, we are allowed 20 minutes in the library. It was get in, get out, get in, get out. And it was like, I fought so hard against that to make that a space where eventually, well, you know, we kind of turned that space into like the rec yard, this community hub to be able to, girl, I came up here to bring you this grievance. Will you look at it? Like to do our those community-based things that we would try to sneak in that setting, right? And it just became this hub of community. And, you know, I told y'all a story about how one particular lady had asked me one day, she said, hey, do you know how I've read, have you ever seen the books that have a little X in the corner of the spine? And I said, You know, now that you mention it, I'm sorry, there's somebody mowing. Now that you mention it, yes, when I put books up, I noticed some of them have this little tiny X that's been drawn on at the top of the spine. She goes, I do that so I can keep up, because she'd been there for years, a decade. And she goes, sometimes I forget which books I've read, so I kind of mark them in this very discreet way. And so every time I put a book up, I would be like, oh girl, that was Deborah. She read that. Like, it was just these little tangible things that we were able to connect to through books in the library.
For sure, my library experience was completely different on the unit. I was on a larger unit, and the culture was a little bit different than the last unit that Jennifer was housed on. So my library experience was, if you were fortunate enough not to be at work, or I don't know, in the bathroom or in the shower when they randomly called library because it wasn't really set time, then you could line up and go. They would allow, I think, 10 at a time to go. We would go to the library. It was no talking. You got berated by the education staff, the officer working education. When you got there, your pat searched in, but you were also not talked to very nice. So it was not a very friendly experience. You go in, you have 5 minutes. It's zero talking. So you pick your books out. It's not, and it's tempting when you're looking for a book to read and someone else is looking in the same section. If you can just imagine how that looks out here, how it's your instinct to say, have you read this one? Or what are you looking for? You know, that's punishable. That's a disciplinary case, and you can get kicked out and lose your library privileges, right? And you pick your book, you go through and check out, and you sit down silently. You sit down at the table and wait for all of that group to finish. It's not a nice experience. I feel like the Texas prison system goes through great lengths to keep the oppressed people oppressed, and by limiting access to reading materials and then making it an not pleasant experience to even go get reading materials at the library. I think that's just one way that they want to keep us in our place, so to speak.
See, and you bring up a good point, right? Like, because the censorship is just a part of it, right? It is the way that we, and that's why it was so important that, you know, when we were doing the research to talk about that second layer of censorship, because I worked in the Wyndham School library, and I was like, people don't even know that they censor what is on these shelves. And this is where, like I said, it's that hub where women come to get books. And so when you are curating what goes on that shelf, right, then you are feeding the message and the images or the theories that you want. And again, for the women that are looking, you know, I remember this lady, she was like, she really wanted, I think it was an Ivan Van Zant book about some of her healing through her trauma, and it was denied. And I remember her saying, it is my experience not important, right? And then she kind of alluded to like all the terrible murder mysteries on the shelves that detail horrible violence towards women, and they don't fall under any of those. Now they could subjectively, because everything's subjective in terms of censorship with books. They don't get denied, right? Like, and it makes you, again, like this whole covert way of saying your experience as a woman with sexual assault is not real. It's not on these shelves. It's not real, right? The narrative in those fiction books about violence towards women is real, not yours. And I saw that time and time again when women were trying to access that stuff. And also the health books. It's just, like Hannah said, it really is a way to negate stories and experiences. And I hope that our research and our talk today really helps people understand it's just one of those ways to control these populations. We
I
can
think
take
it's im-
questions now also. Marci,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. Please put your questions in the chat, or however April's got you guys doing that. But I also just want to point out, you brought up such a good point about sexual assault victims and victims of sexual violence not being able to connect with other survivors, not being able to access stories that will help them process things. And then I just want to point out the number of, statistically, sexual assault, sexual violence victims in the prison system for females. You know, they say that 1 in 3 out here in the free world, and it's in the 90% of sexual violence victims that are female incarcerated in Texas. So it's a huge something. It's there can't really even, there's not a way or for them to even help each other through books, right? So
All
Oh,
right.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, if you're ready for questions.
Yeah,
but-
we're ready. Let's do it.
All right. How can we educate judges regarding women's trauma?
Well, it's something that our group, Lioness, Justice Impacted Women's Alliance, which, by the way, our mission is to end the incarceration, not the mass incarceration, the incarceration of girls, women, and gender expansive people, and to end the devaluing of those populations in our Texas criminal legal system. And one of the ways that we are trying to do that is creating local groups in our communities that those local groups can connect to legislators and council members, DAs, judges in their communities, and start that education piece about our experiences, right? Like I had some really great conversations with some DAs out of Tarrant County. And you know, it takes being vulnerable. And I think that, well, quite frankly, I mean, I think it helps and I think it works, right? Once they see us as people and more than our offenses, right? It's hard to treat people like garbage when you see their humanity. It's very easy to do that when they're not fully human, right? And we saw that as incarcerated folks. So that's the ways that we've been doing it. I would love to hear from the other panelists what they think.
well, for sure through storytelling, like Jennifer, like you said, but also that's kind of Texas After Violence Project. They're recording stories, archiving stories, and all of that is just great information and to spread public knowledge. But yeah, just like Jennifer said, we're tired of being out of sight, out of mind. So our organization is a little more here we are in your face, and you're going to have to look at us and tell us that we don't matter if that's how you feel, kind of thing. So
All right. I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Have any of you ever seen a successful book appeal?
Yes. Yes.
What
And it was,
appeal? What appeal?
A book appeal.
Thank you.
yeah. So, you know, Jake and Harris touched on this a little bit. Like most of the time, especially with women, because they're just, our culture there is very different. If they said it's denied, there must be a reason. I'm not going to appeal it. It doesn't matter. It never works. And I remember that one of this, I wonder if she's watching and I just called her out, but it's okay. She was an ally. One of the secretaries that worked for Windham School District, she had used to work in the mailroom, and I didn't know how the appeal process and the review process worked. And I had been locked up 15 years at that time, right? Like even incarcerated women don't even understand the policies. 20 years and we didn't understand policies, right? And I had brought her something that I had been denied, and I think it was some educational magazine or something, like a National Geographic, which, by the way, again, those are supposed to be exceptions, but the blanket is no, just deny it, right? Like whatever. And I said, I don't understand this, and I would get really angry, like this falls within the exception. And she goes, you need to appeal that. She goes, I'm telling you, I worked in the mailroom for years. That's just one person's opinion in the mailroom. And I was like, what? She goes, yes. And she goes, so what happens if you don't appeal it? That becomes on the list of denials with nobody questions for the whole state of Texas. And I was like, that is absolutely bonkers. She goes, it is important that y'all always deny because, I mean, do the appeal because it goes in front of that review board that Jake and Harris talked about. And that review board can look at it with a little bit better of a, you know, a little bit more clear lens of, no, this falls within. And so I got my magazine, right? But women don't want to go through that, right? In mail rooms at female units, again, is a whole nother, we do a whole nother workshop on that, just the level of pettiness that they are constantly on top of us about. And people don't want to deal with it. Plus, they didn't understand that sometimes it will work. But the fact that very little that we ever grieved or complained about or asked about was ever followed up with, that women are just, they're not going to go through the process. But I did it, and it did work for me that time. Not often, but it occasionally did.
All right. Hannah mentioned that censorship and mail digitization is awfully invisible and makes abolitionism work harder. Are there ways that you can discover that invisible censorship? Because I'm assuming that the Freedom of Information Act probably doesn't apply in this case.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are ways. There's a lot of incredible work specifically being done through FOIAs and through like the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia and stuff to find out how voice-to-text transcription software is being used to monitor mail digitization, things occurring on tablets. So I would point you there. What we're finding is a lot of the keyword searching that's happening through mail digitization and through tablet surveillance is really based on like culturally specific words. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, words like sneeze, cough, illness were being searched most frequently. Wardens typically develop those contracts with each technology platform and decide what those like kind of controlled vocabularies would be. And so I think information professionals and everyone in this room absolutely can work on bringing visibility to that. And if you are the person who asked that question, please feel free to email me and we'll talk more about it.
Does anyone else want to add to that? We got time for questions, so if anyone wants to add in the Q&A, I got one more in the queue. You mentioned COVID, so hey, look at you, like going right into the next question. It seems that sometimes COVID is used as an excuse to close or limit library access. So are there ways that the public could kind of encourage or push back against that?
Well, I mean, in terms of like the prison, I want to say this in terms of the prison system, and Marci knows this best because she was incarcerated during when COVID really started, right? They used COVID for every single thing they could possibly think of to limit access to everything, whether it was visitation mail, library, the chow hall. But they had no problem turning people out in mass and cramming them into hallways to be strip searched to go work on the fields and to work in the kitchen, right? So they limited day room use, the phone. It was like COVID was the excuse for limiting everything except work when they needed it. So I think, you know, I don't know in terms of like the outside world in terms of libraries, but I mean, incarcerated people, especially women, how do you combat that? How do you push back when you're limited access to things? Well, it's really hard because women on the inside have, like Marci said in the chat, really deep fear of retaliation, because retaliation means loss of visitation, loss of phone privileges, and that means loss of access to children. So our ability to protest and push back on things and figure out ways around stuff is always very on the cool, right? And very, we find those, somebody mentioned earlier about those workarounds within our population and to try to get needs met.
And if they're incarcerated in Texas on a female unit, they can write Lioness. And when we start hearing from them, that's what drives our work. So then that lets us do the pushback, right? So that they are not held accountable. So.
All right, one last question. This is for Jake and Harris. What do you think is your next steps after you graduate? Are you going to continue working with these populations and these communities?
So the firm I'm going to does a lot of civil rights work as part of our pro bono practice, and so I will continue. I don't know if it will be specifically related to book bans and fighting those, but there's a large contingency in our practice that does death penalty appeals, especially in Alabama, even though our firm does not have an office in Alabama. But that's a large portion of our practice. So yes, adjacently.
I think I would love to. So Harris and I are part of the Texas A&M Civil Rights Clinic. And so this is my first experience working in the civil rights area of law. And working with Jennifer and Marci has been wonderful. Harris and I are both graduating in May. And like he said, he has a job. I don't have a job yet. So maybe Jennifer and Marci will hire me on and then I'll work for them. But it has been great, and I would love to continue work in this space. It's very important work, is what I've realized.
All right, thank you, everyone, and thank you to our presenters, and thank you for all who attended. Our next session is Interrupting Systems and Activating Imaginations Towards Liberated Futures. It will start in about 14 minutes in the same Zoom room, so we encourage you to stick around. I'm going to put up a little sign, thank you for waiting. So this is a good time to stretch your legs, do all that, and be back shortly.